Hi, everybody. This is Chris,
This is Matt.
and this is
Also, Chris.
also Chris. So this won't get confusing at all. Uh, Today we're interviewing Chris Wilde. Well, not interviewing. I hate that word. It's more of a conversation. And we reached out to you because we played Lords of Midnight, and we're genuinely surprised and blown away by it. So,
I, I have to say, I really enjoyed watching you play it,
thank you.
and part of that was because I actually really felt that you got it. And having had a conversation with a number of other people in the community who have watched that, they also very much said they really felt you got it, and got it from a point of view of without having any retro aspect to it. It was just you saw it for what it was and from when it was, and that was really quite nice to see.
Yeah, thank you.
It. I mean, we're pretty tolerant of retro stuff in terms of graphics and sound and things like that. But what surprised me with this is we didn't need those goggles for this. The game itself holds up so solidly that it's and it's a shame it's not known more. I don't know how it snuck past me because I have played a lot of games. So that this wasn't even something I'd heard of until a little bit ago.
It's one of those things that like a lot of very good 80s games that were done on the Spectrum, just never made it across the pond,
Right.
and
Right.
and has kept on a lot. There's so many games like that that have just disappeared because they weren't recognized anywhere else.
Yeah, I'm going to make after this game, I'm going to make a concerted effort to look into Spectrum games a lot more because that's a crime. It's a crime that they're just disappearing, and
Yeah,
that sort of
Yeah,
was the focus originally of the show when we started. Is I want to catch stuff that like this that never heard of and caught me off guard. So
yeah. Do you have any recommendations on other games that might be kind of sinking into obscurity?
probably just pretty much all of them. Start at the top and work your way through.
All the ZX Spectrum games. Yeah, yeah. It wasn't a platform I was ever familiar with, and it's a shame. Like I was amazed how much there was in Lords of Midnight. There's like trappings of AI and like all those different views. It was just an amazing game.
And I think one of the things is because the machine was, especially coming against the Commodore 64, it was overpowered because the Z80 is a much more powerful chip, but the C64 and that had um, sprites and things like that, and so therefore it always had those kind of arcadey games and things, and that seemed to be. Whereas the Spectrum just did everything in brute force,
yeah,
but did it well and did it very well, and its funny colors and its color clash system and all that kind of stuff kind of made people kind of wonder about it. But it made all the game designers tackle it from that. This is a little bit difficult to work with. How do we do with it? And there's some fantastic games that came out of that.
I you just mentioned the color clash. I have to admit, like when I first saw the graphics for this, I went in with very low hopes, but by the time I was done, I genuinely loved the color clash and the
Yeah,
aesthetic and just
the
the vibe
blue. I
is
love that blue.
so great to that.
And it was an interesting area because that was one of the things that when this went from being a full-on proper reboot that I had originally started with Mike, and then till after his death becoming just a tribute remake. There was just the one moment where Yuri, who did all the graphics, we kind of talked about it and said, how are we going to make this work? We previous with Mike, we'd gone through lots of different graphic ideas and how to change it, how to make it better. I mean, Yuri just sat down and said, we just need to make it look the same. And that even meant, the first version he sent to me, the colors weren't right. And I just said, no, I really meant look the same. You know, and I almost wanted. I said they need to be high res. That was important. But I want you to feel like if you're stood back looking at a picture in a magazine, you look and go, that looks the same. It's the
Mhm.
same. And then it's only when you look at it closely you go, oh no, they're high res versions of the images. But apart from that, everything was had to be the same.
Yeah, it was so tastefully done. Like the remake, I think, kind of blew us both away because it captured what was unique about the original game, and there was just enough added, like the animations when you move
Yeah,
forward. Uh, I mean, they improved the gameplay so much, but it still felt so true to the original, and you could use the original keys if that's what you loved. Like I think we were both really looked at that as like, this is how you remake a game.
Yeah, and I really, when I heard you say that, I thought that is it, because going through the process, and in the early stages, taking a little bit of grief of deciding to stay so close to the original, knowing that I needed to change a few things, but it was ultimately it needed to stay close. And people question that, in modern day, why would you do it this way? Why would you do it that way? And it had to be, no, I need all those people who used to enjoy playing it to just feel like they were at home, and not be distracted and taken out of the moment. And so there was many aspects of that. And the keys, it was interesting watching you play it, and you were talking about the keyboard. I don't know if you know, but the original Spectrum game had an overlay.
Oh, did it?
Yeah, there was a keyboard overlay that stuck over those funny Spectrum sticky up keys that had everything written on. So you put that on and you played it. So there was no question. You didn't need to remember the keys. They were there right in front of you on each key, telling you what you press.
Yeah, that makes way more sense, because the later was. It's not like intuitive, but I totally get it. Like, if you had an overlay, that makes total sense. I can't believe I didn't even think about it.
And again, in the remake, in the options, you can go in and you can say, I want to change the keyboard settings, because I defaulted to the original keys that made no sense, because they don't generally relate to any, it's not even the word, so you don't go, I'll press N for night. You press, something else. And it was a case of, so I did put an option in there that says change it to something that's kind of like, sounds right. And all the keys are then mapped to, D for dawn and things like that. And therefore it was okay. And it gave people the choice to stick with the keys I always know. Because many people just do. They remember the exact keys for all the characters for selecting them. They can just select them straight off the bat because they remember what key was assigned to them. I must admit I can't. But
well, I know
so that was important.
Yeah, when you've put in like hundreds of hours into a game, it starts getting to be muscle memory, and you don't want to mess with that. I hadn't even thought of overlays in years. Man, that's something else that's just sort of missing too, isn't it?
And again, when you go back to when you look at '84 when that game came out, and for it to have a novella, keyboard overlay, and a map, all those aspects it came was just all quite unique at the time. I mean, we think of keyboard overlays now, particularly for like, music and video software and things like that, because you need to control it. But a game with an overlay was just like, what?
Yeah. You mentioned go on.
Oh, I was actually going to bring up the novella too. That was the first thing that struck me, was like how well written that novella was, and how it's not like lore. It just it sets the stage for the whole game. I thought that was really brilliant. We haven't played the rest of the series. Does that kind of continue in the
all the way. So there's obviously the 3 games and there's 3 novellas. There's technically the start of a 4th novella for Eye of the Moon, which obviously never happened. But Mike, before writing too much, a case of he sat down, he wrote practically 5 chapters per each novella, to give him an idea of where the game was going, what he wanted to do, and also just to explain a few things away. There's things in the novella which just makes you look at the game and appreciate it, almost as we talk. You talk about moon ring, this concept of a moon ring that has the power of vision and command. Again, funny listening to you talking about how you're controlling your own people with this ring, and it is. You think, I never really quite thought of it like that. But ultimately, it's nothing more than an excuse as to why you have this first-person control of all these people. And the fact why did you? Someone asked me more recently, why did Mike need to do that? What made him think, I need to explain away how you're playing it and why you're playing it? And it's just like, that's what Mike was like. He just needed to do that because it was about telling the story.
And that's great. That's such a small touch. And I didn't even think about that. Yeah, it's explaining away a mechanic most people would just take for granted. And
the game was designed, the reason why it's snowy is because the graphics were just originally, I don't know if you've heard any of this story, but the original title he started working on was actually called Lords of Atlantis.
Okay.
and it was meant to be a water type game, so everything would just be blue. And it obviously morphed into Lords of Midnight, where it just became white and blue. And it's really, again, got nothing more to do with the fact that dealing with the graphics work was quite intensive. There's an awful lot of graphics getting drawn on that screen. In the original Spectrum, it would take maybe up to nearly a second to draw each view. But it's a case of 2 colors. It made it really nice and easy. And then the spot of color that you had in the actual individual graphics of the characters and stuff, or the shield, just made everything else stand out. And it was nothing more than that's what he had available to him, and that made life easier for him. And then a story comes out of that.
Yeah, no. Can you think of anything else he might have added that way? Because I'm sure I'm missing stuff. The game is so thick in terms of like all these little nuances, like adding the white, and it's a technical limitation, or that he wanted to create a story for the controls.
You can look at the things like the map. The map was obviously, unlike the later games, the map in Lords of Midnight was hand drawn. I have a story from talking with his son Jules. How Jules said he remembered sat on his dad's knee drawing the map and telling him, "Can you draw some of this and do this bit here?" and having an effect. But ultimately, when you actually look at it and when you realise the way the AI plays, and when I've poured through the data to deal with that, you suddenly see the map is drawn in a very particular way to aid the game as well. And it's all those little touches. The AI was working a particular way, therefore the map needed to work in a particular way. If you, for example, retreat back to Zaraketh and play what is commonly known as the Zaraketh defense, where you just sit there and wait for Doomdark to send all his armies down. They just fly down. They're coming down at you from every way. And you just get everybody there and sit there and take them out as they throw themselves against the Citadel walls. But actually looking from that view, you look straight up Corley, you straight up between the mountains, and you can see in the distance Doomdark's armies coming down, and then coming from the east and coming from the west. And you look at it and go, the map was drawn to give that effect. He wanted to channel the armies in that way to make you look at it and go, oh, that looks sick.
I could see that. I'm like, that was the one part of the map I could definitely pick out. I'm like, this is a funnel. And this is a funnel.
And you get that similar approach of Blood. If you try, again, a tactic that's known as the Blood defense, which is very, very difficult, is to get your lords to Blood and hold Doomdark back on the plains of Blood. Never managed it myself, but I know people that have done it.
Oh, that's impressive.
If you're looking at Blood and you're looking up to the Citadels of Gorgrath and around there, and you look at the map that comes from that side, again, it's armies being channeled round to spew out of that gap and to come down to Blood. And again, that's just pure storytelling more than design.
No, and the game almost, like, that was my instinctual defense, was to try and hold them at the top of the funnel and to guard them in those planes. And I'm like, I can't do this. I'm kicked up and down here. This is
that is a very. I'm quite in awe of people that do manage to achieve that, because that takes some working. And interestingly enough, in the remake, it caused me a problem in the fact that the underlying engine works exactly the same as the original does. I've spent a lot of time analyzing all the bits of code and making sure the bits worked the same and gave the same results. But the one thing I just could not get right was that Doomdark's armies would come out of that gap and hit Blood too early. They'd almost be hitting it day 1, day 2. And a number of people who played it during the testing process said, it never worked that way. This is wrong. It's just not right. And I poured through the code again, and I looked through it. And ultimately, the AI is very simplistic, which is, again, one of the beauties about it, because you don't realize quite how simplistic it is. And I looked through it and went, everything about the AI for that says that Doomdark's armies could hit Blood on day 1 if they wanted to. They just didn't. Yeah. On the Spectrum, they just didn't do it. They usually took about day 3, day 4 before they come through the gap. I ended up, to solve the problem, having to put a delay in there to say Doomdark will not push those armies forward any earlier than day 2 because it feels wrong. And it has nothing more to do than random number generation. And that's
wow. I wondered about that because I'm like, he's close. Why is he holding back a couple days? So it's because the Spectrum didn't. The Spectrum just didn't.
Yeah, it's purely because the way that they so in the beginning of the game, all the armies that are there, a number of them have key objectives. Some of them are head towards Morkin, head towards Luxor, head towards certain citadels, head towards routing points and follow the routing points. Some of them just randomly wander. Okay. And then within this movement, they have this kind of thing of looking around themselves to see, is there anything of interest around me? And so if you get within a few locations of one of the wandering armies, they'll pick up on you and make you their focus. And they'll do what they've got to do there. And if they dispatch you, they'll do that and then they'll move on. In the same basis that if they attack you and you manage to run away, they don't come and pursue you because you're of no interest in them. That's not what they're there to do. They'll go back to doing what they were doing previously. But while they're doing that wandering and kind of looking around, it almost is, for some of them, it is almost just roll a dice. Which way am I going to walk today? Roll a dice, I'll go north. Roll another dice, I'll go back south. Because some of them have no objective other than just to walk around.
Yeah.
Some of them that do have an objective will look and go, well, my objective is in this general direction. That's the way I want to walk. What's the best way to get there? And so, for instance, if you're traveling south, it's going to go south, southwest, southeast is a good kind of direction to walk. Roll the dice, that's the way I'm going. Mm-hmm. If something gets in the way, it might walk around it, but ultimately that's the thing. But that random roll of the dice sometimes was enough to make the AI just play very differently than the original. And actually, Doom's Dark Revenge caused me far more problems with that because obviously I'm presuming you've not looked at Doom Dark Revenge much yet, or if at all. The AI in that is more complicated. Both, there's not just armies moving around for the enemy, but there are actual lords. There's 128 lords in total. And some of those are Ice Guard lords, some of them are giant lords, some of them are dwarf lords, some of them are fey lords. But they also have their own objectives. And they'll wander around and they'll take care of things. They're looking for things and they'll attack each other and stuff like that. And again, when playing that, people will come to me and say, they're not doing what they used to do. And it's like, no, they are. They're doing exactly what they used to. You just remember them being better. And the reality is they were pretty dumbass AI bots. Mm-hmm. They didn't get it well very often. But it's that mind thing that people remembered from playing it. They remembered it working in a particular way. And to some extent, you look and say that was the important part of the games. It's very much the imagination, which going back to the novellas was very much, you start this game with a good feeling for what you're about to do because of the story you've been told. So.
Yeah, I love it just like hands you off straight from the novella. Like they're at the tower in the novella, and then you're at the tower when you start the game, and it's like perfectly cohesive. I thought that was really good.
When me and Mike started originally talking about rebooting the process, we talked about that area as if to, if you think of more modern games where you've almost got the in-game tutorial that you start to play before you really get yourself going. We looked at that side of things and said, how can we potentially start the game earlier? The novella's not going to be there. People are not going to read it. How do we impart the same information? We looked at maybe doing some form of animated graphic novel, some cut scenes or whatever we were going to do. And then we just felt like, what if we just start the game a little bit earlier? What if we start the game while Luxor and Morkin are on their way to the tower? And craft that first process of learning how to move around and maybe make it so, obviously the only thing you can really do is head to the tower and meet Rawthorn and meet up with Corlith and start the process. But by the time you get there, you've got a good feeling of how to move around, how to do the things in a way that is more a modern way of doing things. Mm-hmm. Whereas obviously back there it's like, read the book, that tells you what you want to do.
Do you think anything's lost by this switch to a modern way of doing things? Do you think we've lost stuff or do you think it's a better way of going?
I wouldn't say better and I wouldn't say worse. It's obviously just different. The attention span that people have nowadays for playing games or doing anything is so much different that, sticking a book in front of people, I can imagine now. I mean, I don't know if you played like Elite Dangerous and things like that. If you go back to Elite being also one of those early 80 games that came out with a novella, although it was probably more of a novel in its case rather than a novella. People playing Elite Dangerous are not going to sit there and go, "Yeah, I'll just read this book," and they're not playing the game. So you've got to have that. I guess the key is just you've got to get that balance between the two of, with something like Lords of Midnight, which is such a storytelling game, it would be a case of, well, we need to still tell that story. Let's not lose sight. There's a story that needs to be told here. We've got to get a feeling across. And I think you'd be able to do that. Difficult, but you'd be able to do it. And I think it could work. It just takes money.
Yeah, it always takes money. Tougher question for you. Anything you regret changing? Are there anything you put in where you're like, oh, I wish I could take that out?
Not really. Nothing I would wish I'd taken out. There's a few things that I would have probably done differently with more time. Again, the history of the process. If you think that, so Mike died in the October, and suddenly at one point I wasn't going to continue with the game. It was like, we're done. Me and Mike were talking about a very different product, and so therefore I can't see myself doing it. And then over a while, talking for a few people, it was a case of no, okay, I need to do something. And that was the idea, to make it kind of a just something for him, a dedication to him, to say, look, this is the process. Everything happened very quickly after that.
Yeah.
So I probably started working on it mid-November properly, and I shipped to the Apple Store the week before the solstice, because the solstice became December the 21st thing became an important thing to have release. And so I kind of had to do that. So it all happened very quickly. So then when I look back after the release, and I'd already started thinking about, I had different platform versions to do, because there was only me doing the coding, and I had to support iOS, Android, Windows, OS X, back then also BlackBerry, Android Fire, etc., Windows Phone eventually, and all that. And so I never got a breathing space to look back and go, what didn't quite work? There were some UI elements that I would have liked to have changed. It really annoys me the think screen is not very... We mentioned about the fact that the text sometimes get cut off the bottom. I wish it'd been more dynamic. I wish that screen had been a bit more obvious, that, have it scrolling and things like that. The little key bits like that, which just didn't seem to, it felt non-phone, which obviously was my lead platform, non-phone intuitive. And I would have probably paid a bit more attention to them had I given myself more time. It's not that I didn't have time, I didn't give myself the time. So nothing I would have particularly taken out.
I was going to say, that is an impressive list of platforms you had to get this on. That is not a small list.
And I spent a lot, because, working the day job and all that kind of stuff. And I spent a lot of my evenings just plowing through that and getting, it to work on all the different platforms and stuff. And also, I didn't really take much of a breath after finishing that and then going straight into Doomsday Revenge. The one thing I took from it was, when I look back and actually did take a breather for a moment, I went, I did that. Me on my own, Yuri's helped doing the graphics, but me on my own, I hit all those platforms. Thinking of doing that cross-platform game like that, and I look back and I went, wow, I should give myself a pat on the back for managing that. That was
I was going to say, as other developers, we'll pat you on the back for that, because that is... That's our day job, and we're like, oh, I wouldn't want to do that. That's crazy. So let's go way back. How did you first find, how did you first play Lords of Midnight? What was your first introduction to it?
My introduction was actually through my older brother. He got a ZX Spectrum before I did, back before I was not even interested in computers or anything like that. That was not on my radar. And I was just bumbling through school, doing what I did, which was mainly just enjoying being at school and having a laugh. And he got this ZX Spectrum, and for Christmas, I think it was. And I started looking at it and going, what's this about? What can I do with this? And that's when I first started coding, just because it was like, back then again, you got a computer, you got a manual, and it's you had to write stuff in BASIC, and it's like, well, hey, and I suddenly found I could do that. But we started playing the various different games that he had, and Lords of Midnight was one of them, because he was kind of interested in, he was reading a lot of fancy books at the time and all that, and he was interested, and I just watched him play and just found myself playing it. And so then I went through Lords of Midnight, Doom's Art Revenge. During that time, Dark Scepter, which is another one of Mike's. And just like a lot of people at that time, just fell for it. You fell for that. I was playing a lot of games. I was playing the shoot 'em ups. I was playing the arcade games. I was playing adventure games. But nothing just immersed you in the same way that Lords of Midnight did. And so then it was, just around the 90s, beginning of the 90s, I started my first, I think I'd been working since about 89 in my first job, and I had a bit of cash, and I bought myself a new ZX Spectrum Plus 3. But I'd been obviously on the PC since, for a few years, and I bought this Plus 3, and I was looking at things to do, and I started writing some sprite routines to write some games, because it was like, I've been doing stuff previously, but I really want to focus on this. And then one day I went, how did Lords of Midnight work? And that was it. That just became, I needed to know how it worked. And so in iCloud, it was a case of I wrote some software to allow me to disassemble the game. I ended up hooking it up back through the parallel port on the serial port on a PC, and getting stuff down. I had to write a special disassembler to disassemble the game, because the game doesn't disassemble very well with normal disassemblers, because Mike did a lot of tricks to make stuff fit in memory. Disassemblers didn't like them. Stuff data is interspersed in between instructions and things like that. And so I had to write a special disassembler to do it, and got through the process, and then I documented it and commented it all, and I had this thing. And then me and a friend just went, could we make this work on a PC? And we wrote what I still like to think of as like almost one of the first almost emulators. If anything, it's more of a just-in-time compiler.
Okay.
What it did is it took the Z80 code and went, what would I do with this if it was 8086? And that's what it did. And it created me a whole 8086 compiled version of the game. I just then had to fix up a few things like the graphics routines. All that happens is the game thinks it's running on a Spectrum. It creates a Spectrum screen, and then periodically I just go, put that on the PC. And that was it. And that was the start of that process, which then turned into an epic long journey of my development with Lords of Midnight.
So, like, when you were in this progress, did you contact Mike? Did Mike contact you? Who reached out first there?
So originally, I'd done Lords of Midnight DOS, and then I did Doom's Art Revenge DOS, and this was back in the days where I can't even remember what we were using for communicating online and things like that. I remember spending a lot of times in the old Usenet forums and things like that. I tried to reach out to Mike, because I was like, I want to make this available to people. I think people would enjoy playing a DOS version of it. And I ended up through one of the Usenet groups speaking to a guy called John Rittman, who was a 80s, still is a programmer, games programmer. He was particular. He wrote a lot of very classic Spectrum games, Head Over Heels, Batman, amongst other things. And I got talking to him, and he put me in contact with Mike.
Okay.
And so we had a quick email conversation. I said, this is what I want to do. I want to make it available to people. No money's changing hands. I just want people to play it. And he was like, yeah, crack on, do it.
Nice. Love
the idea. So I put it out there. People could download it off some FTP site and stuff like that. And then I think it was about 94, he was working on Lords of Midnight 3, The Citadel, which was his first branching, taking the game into a more modern, proper 3D, real time, all that kind of stuff. And he turned around to his producer and said, I want the DOS games on there. I want people to be able to play the originals, and the DOS games are the way of doing it. Because again, it was kind of emulators were a bit shaky at that time. They were just starting the process. And so Domark, who it was released to at the time, kind of IDOS Domark, they were just transitioning. Their producer got in contact with me and said, "Chris, Mike would like your permission." And I'm like, "Well, really? My permission?" It's like, how does that work?
Right.
So it's like, yeah, absolutely. You can put my games of his games on his game. And so they, not only did they end up on the CD there, but they were referenced in the manual. Mike talked about it. He said basically the originals are there for you to play. You can just fire them up and play them and all that kind of stuff. So that kind of kicked that. And then around that time, I managed to meet him a couple of times at some computer shows and stuff. And that's where we started kind of having a friendship. So.
Cool. Now, I mean, we've talked a lot about Lords of Midnight. Is that your favorite of his games, or is there another one that you might say, oh, you should, if you really want to get into it, you should play Doomdark's Revenge or something?
No, so Lords of Midnight is my favorite, out and out. Mainly, I think it's first time to it and all that kind of stuff. And most people I meet, enjoy Lords of Midnight. And that also tells in the sales for the remake. Bearing in mind it was a sold product. I didn't give this away free because the money that it makes, a good chunk of it goes to Mike's family.
Right.
And I think Lords of Midnight, I've done about getting close to 50,000 units now across all the platforms. Doomsday Revenge has probably done about 10,000 units. Okay. So again, that bears up the fact that more people know Lords of Midnight, played Lords of Midnight. Doomsday Revenge is different. And it's different because you see where Mike was moving the AI forward. Okay. And it does this thing which is procedural generated. Again, we're talking 85, and we're talking a game that he did crank out in about 3 months.
Oh, wow.
The data for Lords of Midnight just about fits on the Spectrum. So much so that the original map was 64 by 64 in size. But it's not. That's not the map that's in the game. So when the box tells you how many views there are, because they calculate it out by the 64 by 64 by 8 kind of thing, it's actually wrong. Because the map's actually only 64 by 62. Because Mike removed 2 rows off the bottom because he needed the 128 bytes that gave him. And the save game still saved those 2 rows, even though it doesn't need to. It's just because that's I think how late that whole process happened. So when he came to do Doomsday Revenge, where the map is 96 by 60 or 64 by 96, I should say, he was going to struggle for memory, and there's a lot of new processes to deal with the memory aspect, and one of them was to procedurally generate a map. So it's also, when you play Doomsday Revenge, you'll find that all the locations are far less memorable. They are proper fantasy names, whereas Lords of Midnight, you've got Dawn and Whispers and real English words.
Right.
Yeah. And then you've got the odd one thrown in like Zarakith and Rawthorn and things like that, just to spice it up a bit. Doomsday Revenge is just full-blown. All the names are completely non-memorable.
Oh, that's...
Because they were generated. The map was generated, the names were generated, lots of things like that happen. And the game therefore loses an aspect of the feeling of playing it. However, what it makes up for is the gameplay is much more strategic. The process that you're going through, with all these characters wandering around, doing their own thing and all that kind of stuff. And so what you get is you get a large amount of people who play the games who think Doomsday Revenge, that's their favorite, because they like that aspect of it. It's much more intense in the strategy side of things and so on. Whereas most people find Lords of Midnight more favorable because it's more memorable and more enjoyable. As you move forward, Dark Scepter is quite a remarkable game in its time. If you've never seen that, definitely that's something you should check out. And then you see his stuff start to move forward. So the way you get his next real big thing was Midwinter. And I always like to think of Midwinter as it's Lords of Midnight 16-bit.
Okay.
It's Mike coming to the same concept and saying, right, how would I do this now? I've got all this more power. And when you look at it, you'll realize that, again, he was doing something revolutionary that we now take for granted. You know, it's a first-person, free-roaming sandbox game where you can walk around, do everything, and all that kind of stuff. When you look at it, you'll go, yeah, graphically, I don't see the same kind of parallels. But when you see what he was starting off at the time that he started off, Midwinter is another one where it's pivotal.
Mm-hmm.
And it is pivotal in the games industry. There's an awful lot of big games now where people turn around and go, I started at Midwinter. Midwinter's what got me here. You know? and so, yeah, that is a very definite, you know, if you check any other game out of his, it would be Midwinter.
Okay.
And you also see the transition. As a game designer, you see what he did with Lords of Midnight, what flowed through to Doomsday Revenge, what actually flowed through to Midwinter and Flames of Freedom, which was the follow-up to Midwinter. And then more impressively is a game called Ashes of Empire, which is just really hard to play because it's to do with Russia and all that kind of stuff. And it's very, very political. But what you see is that where all the game design was going to get him to that point. And therefore, you could imagine, had he been able to keep a studio together and have control of his development studio and have a team that would go where he was going in the long term with game design, it's just a shame he never was able to do that because you see all the points. I kind of liken it a little bit to David Lynch, and this is going to sound really strange. You know, you watch a David Lynch film and you kind of, whether you like David Lynch or not, you go, whoa, but there's some really key things in here. And then you see them in somebody else's film and you go, all right, yeah, it works here. I understand it. Because what they've done is they've looked at what David Lynch did and go, I know how to dilute this.
Right.
I know how to make it work. And I like to think Mike is very much like that. As a game designer of his time, he was trying things that didn't always work. But people look back on that and go, well, we can make this work now. We know how to do this. But we wouldn't have necessarily thought about it if it wasn't for what Mike did originally.
I kind of miss that about old games where people would just throw stuff at the wall and see what stuck. And I'm looking forward now to going through his catalog and talking about the evolution each time we get to the next game.
Yeah.
That'll be fun to see what's added and taken.
It's interesting when you see what doesn't work as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you admit. So for instance, by the time 95 came around and Mike gets, you know, somehow his studio get attached to develop a game for IDOS, Domark. And he decides, I was always going to do Eye of the Moon, which was the third part of the game. And this might be the time to do it. We'll do it 16-bit, or it's kind of 1632 at that transitional time. Mm-hmm. You know, he started writing a game for DOS, which then moved into being a Windows 95 game and so on. But he looked at him and then he pulled back and he said, I'm not going to do Eye of the Moon. I don't really want this IP sullied and held by another publisher. And I can't own this myself. So I'm going to do a different Midnight story. So what he effectively did is he went, the story that I had intention for Eye of the Moon now becomes part 4. We parked that and I'm going to slot a new game in between, you know, and that's what Lords of Midnight and Citadel became.
Okay.
When you see the game and how it works, you see where, I get what you did from Midwinter and Flames of Freedom and Ashes of Empire. And I can see all these things and how they've now moved into how you think Lords of Midnight should work in a more modern environment. And it's there's no turn-based, it's real time. You set up a character doing something and they just carry on doing it. There's no night. You know, the day it goes day and night as it goes on. You don't control that. You move around your characters, and while you move to another character, your other characters will carry on doing what they were doing, and you'll get interruptions to say, you know, Morkin's in trouble. You might want to go and check him out. You know, things like that, and you can tell the characters, I want you to go to this location, and they just go, right, okay, and off they go, and they do it, and it just doesn't work. You know, it lost the essence of what the original games were. I think he could have made it work with more time and more play testing and all that kind of stuff, but the issues he had at that time became difficult.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was actually thinking, like, because when I play these, I'd go through in my head, like, what would I change? What would I do? And that was one of the things I thought, like, is there some way we could, like, pick a spot and say, go there, and then just have time flow? But that destroys the vibe, huh?
Well, I think so. The movement process of that would still work. I think,
Okay.
and it's potentially something I'm looking at for. One of my plans is to retrofit the Citadel back from being a real-time 3D game, but to go. What would it been like if Mike had done it on the original Spectrum? So cool. I've got the engines now. I've got this technology. I can use it again. So let's do the Citadel. Let's explore the game design, work out what needs to change to take it back. It'll be still a landscaping game. It'll be 2D and all that kind of stuff. So looking at that process. But part of the process means it is a big game. The map should be 512 by 512, which is huge. It's not going to be that back. I've scaled it back. But ultimately, you still got a lot of map. You've got a lot of characters. And so the concept of having to say, look, I just need you to go from A to B, because I'm not going to be doing much on the way.
No.
When I get at B, we'll do some recruitment, we'll do some battles, whatever. But you go there and take care of it. I think that can still work in a turn-based night turn game, because ultimately you're just saying, just before night, as it were, just before the enemy gets their chance, which in the Citadel is Boroth the wolf heart. You take your turn. You move the places you need to do, and the next morning, I might just get some visual indication of, you might want to check this person out because he was in a battle overnight or he was attacked or whatever. But ultimately, all I'm asking them to do is move from A to B. I wouldn't go as far as engaging them in full-out war or making them, go here and recruit this person. It would just be walk from A to B. When you get there,
let me know.
Yeah. Whereas the original Citadel, they actually did walk.
Mm-hmm.
And you watch them walk in real time. If you were moving your characters around and you go, right, what's Morkin doing now? And you flick back to him and go, he's walking. That's interesting. And you just see him walking over the landscape. Trees are going by, whatever. And it's like, that's not very interesting.
No. What, you mentioned Morkin and you mentioned the strategy. What's your favorite way to play? Do you try to, go and get the Ice Crown, or do you do the strategy to win?
I'm all out. I need the complete victory. So,
okay, very good.
but I do it in my limited kind of way, which is the fact that I can't hold a blood defense or even a dawn defense or a shimmeral defense and all that kind of stuff. I'm very much it's the recruitment phase for me. I love the recruitment phase. Recruit all the characters, pick up all the soldiers, get back to Zarakith, and I usually hold most of my lords out of Zarakith. The rest of them will all be up at either Ithron or Dawn.
Okay.
And then hold out for a few days. Let Doomnut throw his armies at you, take them out. Once he's kind of retreated and it's gone quiet, then I, one by one, slowly push north.
Okay.
Taking back every single keep and citadel that was lost along the way. Mm-hmm. Because one of the other things that happens is the ice sphere is governed by how many citadels and keeps you've lost. So as Doomdark pushes south and takes over more, the ice sphere gets stronger and stronger and stronger. So then when you push back and start to take them off, again, it starts to lighten up. So then you get in a situation where you're up near Ushgrak. You can do that final push, but you do that final push ready with, I've got the Ice Crown, Farflame or Forkrin or Lorgrim is around. I'm not far from Lake Mirror, whatever it's going to be. And then you go, right, on that last turn, Ushgrak falls, get ready to destroy the Ice Crown. Game, night, you've got a complete victory because there's not a single of Doomdark's armies on the map. You've wiped them out from absolutely everywhere. And that's how I like to play it. So.
Did reverse engineering change how you played the game? Did you learn a lot about the mechanics that kind of affected your strategies?
I think, yeah. I mean, unfortunately, that's always going to happen because when you start to realize what's actually happening and not what you think is happening, I'm kind of segueing on that. It was interesting that you mentioned in one of your pre-questions that concept of things you got wrong in when you were talking about the game. And there was one or two things that while you were discussing things that happened, and I'm sat there going, yeah, that doesn't happen. That's not how it works. And I decided I was going to go through and tell you this. And I went, no, I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to tell you those things.
I love that. That makes me so happy.
Mainly because that's how people remember the game. Yeah. People remember the game as they remember the game. And the fact that, certain things did or didn't happen, they believe it did. Yeah. So, great, you stick with that belief. I'm not going to... one thing I will say in that, which is not related to you actually saying it, but the manual tells you that Utharg the Utharg, King of the Barbarians, he's a nasty piece of work. And if you ever recruit him, the manual explains that if you don't keep him sweet, he will leave you and he will go against you and he will go and join Doom's Ark forces and fight against you. Yeah, it doesn't happen.
I was wondering.
There is no code in the game to make that process. And when you realize that, and it's like, and I spoke to Mike about it many years later and said, what happened with Utharg? And he went, yeah, I just ran out of time and memory. And unfortunately, it was too late to change the manual. Because back then, again, the manuals were printed well in advance and he was such a tight deadline. And he said, so that's the way it is. And I have had people tell me they've had Utharg, leave them overnight and attack them the next morning. It's like, okay, you live with that. It never happened. I know it never happened. But I'm quite happy for you to have that kind of, that kind of memory of it.
I'm betting one of the things I got wrong then is Fuzzkins murdered Morkin in the night, but that is definitely what it looked like. That is so what it looked like. I'm like, there's no one else around. I've done a sweep. Wake up the next morning, he's dead. I'm like, to me, that's what happened.
So the process with that, and this again goes back to something else you said with the battles. I think you probably came across this thing where, you woke up in the morning and you were in a different location. It's like, I did go there. What am I doing in the mountains? I was not in the mountains last night, and now I'm in the mountains. And that comes out of the fact that when you are attacked during the night, if you've lost all your soldiers or you didn't have any soldiers, the chance of you actually dying, again, is a bit of a coin toss. So you've lost. Doom's, the game engine's decided you lost that battle. So then it goes, should I kill you? The first thing it does is say, have you got a horse? If you've got a horse, maybe I'll kill your horse first. And then it goes, right, you've not got a horse, maybe I'll kill you. Or I'm just going to move you to another location. And it just displaces you by a random location, just one step in any of the 8 directions. And so you suddenly find yourself somewhere where you weren't the night before. And so that kind of thing happened. The main thing is the army that attacked you have moved on.
Right.
They came in, they attacked you, and they went. And you're no the wiser because unless you actually read the message that says you're involved in the battle overnight, which is easy to miss, you just carry on. And I suspect that's one of the things you were, that side of the map, Morkin has armies whose sole objective is to track him down.
Yep.
And once they tracked him down, and if they manage to kill him, they go, right, okay, now we're going after Luxor. And so they get in and they get out, and you never saw them come, right. And that's my gut feeling on that one.
Mine too, but I
like the idea.
It's a great story, yeah.
I picked him up. I decided to take him with me and was murdered the next morning. Okay, he can follow behind me now.
and now that that's come up, I might have to add it into a new campaign at some point.
Well, I just, after watching Lord of the Rings and, realizing the corollaries between what we're doing here, I'm like, this is Gollum. I know exactly who this is.
Yeah.
And so...
So you're projecting, basically.
It felt right.
But it's also, the main thing is, that is also key to the experience. I love the fact that you felt that.
Yeah.
Because I love the fact that you were able to feel and think that that's what actually happened. When the reality is you can look at it and say, actually, it was all in your head. But that is the key of Lords of Midnight.
Yeah.
So much of it is in your head that, it's that bizarre thing that Mike managed to design a game where actually we just feel like we just jacked in. And it's like, I'm now part of this game because what you think is happening and what you're actually doing is all part of the process.
I can think probably on one hand the number of games that have given me that moment
Mm.
of feeling it and feeling the moments and feeling the story with such limited interface, such
Yeah.
limited feedback, that it's so impressive.